Hello and welcome, Lockdown Defenders. This is Coach Mike, and today we are breaking down Game 2 of the Jazz Clippers back-to-back. The Jazz defense prevailed in the first matchup, but with Kawhi and Paul George back in the lineups, the Clippers got the better of the Jazz defense. Let's see how the Clippers countered one of the league's best defenses.
Man, oh man, what a defensive play. Tremendous defense. Wow.
But before we get to this breakdown, I have a special announcement. I'm releasing a Lockdown Defense book. If you love the techniques covered on this channel, you'll love this book, jam-packed with drills, techniques, and coaching tips of how to improve and develop great defenders. The book is due to release in the next 2 weeks, so if you want to stay up to date and be one of the first to own one, join the group and go to lockdowndefensebook.com and sign up for the newsletter and the latest information. Now let's get back to the breakdown. If you haven't already watched the breakdown of Game 1, I suggest you do so. You can follow the adjustments the Clippers and Jazz are making from game to game. And if you remember in our first video, the Clippers went more to a middle drag screen attack to avoid the sideline channel the Jazz use. The Clippers picked up where that adjustment left off, coming into the game bringing the ball up the middle of the floor more in transition and using middle ball screens. In this example, Kawhi rejects the middle ball screen, draws two defenders, and Ibaka hits the open pop. The next time the Jazz do a better job of funneling Paul George into the ball screen, and you can see they have their big man higher in the drop coverage. Paul George does a great job of engaging the big and bouncing it out for the pull-up jumper. This time Lou Williams brings the ball at the sideline, but Zubac does a good job of staying disciplined and setting it in the middle third, which allows Lou to attack the middle of the floor against Favors, and again they get these pull-up jumpers. Although this gave the Clippers success with all three ball handlers, including an Ibaka pop for three, the Clippers weren't ready to settle in for mid-range jumpers. So they started to use pick and rolls more to exploit mismatches and switches. You can see Lou gets right by Niang here and gets the floater for two. So starting the second quarter, the Clippers went back to how they started to attack the Jazz in the first game, clearing out the ball side and setting these drag screens on the wing. Two things to notice here. The Jazz kept their adjustment from Game 1 of funneling Lou into the ball screen and not allowing him to drive baseline on the right side of the floor. The second thing to notice is the Clippers didn't set this screen with their big. Instead, they dove the big opposite, low, and set it with Morris. Again, you can assume this was to avoid the channel coverage and instead get the switch to exploit the mismatch. The Jazz actually avoid a switch by dropping shallow and recovering, but Morris is still able to beat Niang off the dribble to the baseline and hits the baseline corner for the three. Clippers were also happy to get Clarkson in a switch to isolate instead, and this time they set it with Reggie Jackson to get it. Lou doesn't attack one-on-one and instead gives it to Paul George, which allows us to see what the Clippers can flow into from this new alignment. The big running up to set a step-up slot screen like the Clippers preferred to attack in the first game. Gobert does a good job of containing Paul George and is able to get a high contest on the mid-range pull-up. We can see the Jazz had adjusted to this in preparation for Game 2 by shifting Gobert way up in his drop coverage to about the three-point line. This would try and neutralize the three-point abilities of Paul George and Kawhi in this action. Instead force him to drive and settle for mid-range jumpers. Even the first time they ran it in the first quarter, you can see how high Gobert was, and this time Kawhi rejects it and gets the pull-up three anyway, which he's unable to knock down. And so after several failed attempts of attacking with the slot step-up screen, even this one where Reggie Jackson drives Gobert and looks for the switch inside, and although it looked like a great look, the Jazz were able to come up with stops in this action several times, so the Clippers changed what they wanted out of it. Instead, using the slot step-up screen to get mismatches they wanted and attack one-on-one. This time targeting Clarkson on the switch and isolating him against Lou Williams, and despite the Clippers going small, Gobert still comes off of Morris in the corner and protects the rim. And despite getting favorable matchups, even with Kawhi as the ball handler, the Jazz trusted their individual defense, knowing Gobert would still be in the paint no matter who he was guarding. Thus, they trusted they could protect the rim and take away threes, and made the Clippers hit these tough mid-range jumpers. Even into the second half, you could see how far Gobert was helping in these mismatch situations, and judging by the Clippers' decisions, how little they wanted Ibaka to get those threes. Again, forcing tough mid-range shots, and this time Kawhi can't knock it down. Knowing it wasn't the best recipe for success, the Clippers went back to attacking the bigs in these slot ball screens. The Jazz continued their high drop to contain the ball handler, but the Clippers had a counter. They hit Ibaka on the pop, knowing the Jazz have to somewhat respect him on this action. Ingles does a quick stunt off of Beverly to take away Ibaka's three, but Ibaka swings it immediately to Beverly to attack the gap. A beautiful play design by Ty Lue, and they get the finish at the rim. When the Clippers go back to it, it appears the Jazz had adjusted to hard hedge these step-ups. Kawhi smartly recognizes this and rejects it as Conley gets out of position. Favors does an incredible job at recovering and gets the block at the rim. In fact, I would say the Jazz were pretty satisfied with their pick and roll coverage for the most part. They were able to force the Clippers into a lot of tough twos while protecting the rim and taking away threes. The difference in this game, however, as opposed to the first, was Kawhi and Paul George are just much better at hitting those tough shots. One interesting adjustment the Clippers could make going into the future was what happens on these three plays against the Jazz pick and roll. By driving aggressively, they forced the Jazz into a switch. The Clippers were then able to pull Gobert out on these one-on-one isolation matchups. A tough matchup for any big, especially against Paul George or Kawhi. Paul George is unable to get it in that time, but if we look at this next play, Paul George is able to cause the switch, pull it out, and then draws Conley off the corner three. He's able to knock it down against Gobert. Later in the game, they actually replicate the same sequence from the first switch, driving the pick and roll hard, kicking it out to the wing, and then getting the isolation in the corner. If these teams do meet again in the playoffs, this will be an interesting adjustment the Clippers can make, and it will be very interesting to see how the Jazz can counter it. The Clippers also tried what was most successful in Game 1, this zoom action, with a down screen into a handoff. The Clippers found their most success in Game 1 with this action, and you can see the first time they run it in Game 2, Paul George gets a good split against the high drop and is unable to convert the good look at the rim. However, the Jazz were much more prepared for it in this game, doing a good job of going under against some personnel living with these shots, and then against key players, chasing tightly or switching to deny, which you can see in this clip here, leaving Ibaka on an island who forces the tough two. This would be a nice play to counter the Jazz defense. You can see they re-screen the under and Kawhi drives the big. The Jazz defense collapses around the roller and Lue feels hard to the top and they hit him, and he can now attack the tag and gets a nice floater at the rim. Instead, what the Clippers relied most of on Game 2 was their post-up game. If we look back at Game 1, they ran quite a few of them, but without Paul George or Kawhi Leonard, they ran it for Morris, and he had limited success. Now into Game 2, they could run it for Kawhi, Paul George, or Morris. The first time they run it, we can't see the play develop, but it appears to be a Kawhi down screen for a Paul George. The Jazz seemed confused on the coverage and left Kawhi open at the rim. Despite the Jazz recover effectively and it turns into a Kawhi post-up. We can see there's a lot of help and Gobert even comes for the trap. They kick it out for Ibaka and he's unable to hit the three. The Jazz continue with their defensive game plan and continue to help heavily off Ibaka and even trap with Gobert. The Jazz do a good job of rotating out on the kick out and contest the three. Even if it was Paul George in the post, they would try in front and again help heavily with Gobert. The Clippers found their counter pretty quickly, encouraging the front and then swinging it to Ibaka up top to draw out the big and then throw the high-low. The next time they get Kawhi in the post, it appears they have the high-low pass again if they throw it to Ibaka. We see Mitchell pointing to Clarkson as the low man, which could preview what their adjustment's about to be. Instead, Beverly drives it in this clip, and Kawhi gets the in to out cut for a good 3 that he's unable to convert. The Clippers don't look for that high-low look again, instead feeding it from the wing either over the top or into the post, and you can see the Jazz are ready to rotate and even trap from the weak side. Still, the talent of Kawhi is able to prevail, as we just saw him get that 2, and this time he draws the foul. Despite the Jazz's team defensive approach to stopping him, Kawhi can still make it hard even on the NBA's best defenses. If you haven't watched, this full game came down really to the fourth quarter. The Clippers went to a set they found success in the first game, this Horns flare action. The first time setting it with Lou Williams. The Jazz continued to hedge and recover, staying attached to Lou, and Ingles takes a good route to cut off Paul George, but Paul George is still able to hit the tough 2. The next time they run it, George and Kawhi are out, so they run it with Lou. Again, the Jazz hedge, and they do a good job containing the action, but the Clippers flow into a handoff, and Morris is able to hit the foul line jumper. Continuing to hold on to a 3-point lead, they run the same play again, but this time putting Reggie Jackson in the screener role. Now when Lou comes off, they actually switch the guard to guard, and he's able to drive past Clarkson and doesn't convert the basket, but gets the foul call. With a little more than 8 minutes to go in the game, the chess match really began, as Tyronn Lue decided to go small, leaving Morris as his 5. Quinn Snyder immediately responded and subbed out Gobert to put in Favors. Although the Jazz might trust Favors more to defend the perimeter, the Clippers continued to put him in middle ball screens. The first time they hit Morris on the pop, and Brogdon does a good job of rotating out to the switch. You can see on the weak side, Kawhi comes back to get the ball, but the Jazz do a good job of switching out of that mismatch. And instead, Morris flows into a strong side action with Williams, and they continue to get nothing. The Clippers have to settle for this ISO at the top of the key as the shot clock goes down, and it doesn't go in. The next time down, they repeat the action and again hit Morris on the pop. This time Mitchell's late on getting there to the switch, and Morris gets the open 3, but doesn't knock it down. The Clippers pivot their strategy and instead use their small ball lineup to space the floor and try and get Kawhi favorable matchups, hunting Clarkson on these switches. The Jazz decide to counter by hedging with Clarkson, and Kawhi still gets past him and drives to the paint. O'Neal does a good job recovering and forces a tough 2, and Kawhi doesn't knock it down. The Clippers try again to get Clarkson in a screening action with Kawhi, but the Jazz are unwilling to straight switch it. Instead, it looks like they try and channel it with Clarkson as the drop, but Kawhi does a good job of shielding him off and driving, but Clarkson's able to get the steal. Now it's become a 2-point game, and the Clippers have to pivot their strategy again. This time going back to a Morris pick and roll, but this time with Paul George as the ball handler. Paul George is able to force the downhill switch and gets Favors for a foul. Now with a 4-point cushion, the Clippers repeat the same strategy, using Paul George as a ball handler and Morris setting the screen. The Jazz use their high channel coverage and stunt with O'Neal on the pop, but Morris still confidently takes the 3 and makes it a 7-point game. Back to a 7-point deficit with little more than 4 minutes left in the game, Quinn Snyder decides to go back with Rudy Gobert in the lineup. The Clippers continue with their small ball approach of using Paul George as the ball handler and setting slot step-up screens with Morris. You can see the Jazz's first thought was to counter by leaving Gobert out of the action, putting him on Pat Beverly in the corner. This allowed Brogdon to switch the step-up screens and try and contain Paul George. Despite pretty good defense, PG is able to get separation and hit the tough step back. Still holding on to a 7-point lead, they repeat the same exact action. This time Paul George drives more aggressively, and as Gobert collapses, they hit Pat Beverly in the corner and he knocks down the 3. Now a 10-point game, the Clippers are going to continue this action 2 more times in a row. The Jazz continue to play it the same way, switching, and this time Paul George takes the 3, but misses. Finally, with less than 3 minutes, they run it again, this time with Kawhi. They don't get the switch, but they still cause a collapse by Gobert and hit Beverly for the open 3. He doesn't hit it, and it's still a game. With less than 2 minutes to go and the game basically out of reach, the Jazz try their final adjustment of switching the matchups, putting Gobert on Batum instead of Beverly. The Clippers choose to put Gobert in the action, and this time Paul George drives, collapses Gobert, kicks out, and the Jazz execute a full rotation to take away the open threes. It ends with a Morris ISO as the shot clock expires. But time just ran out for the Jazz as they got it back to a 7-point game but couldn't come up with 2 defensive rebounds with less than a minute to go, and so they needed to start fouling to extend the game, and that would all but solidify the win for the Clippers.
Gets the rebound. And now it does it again. Yes.
Again, it was a game of small adjustments and counters. Most interesting, we saw the Clippers go to their small ball lineup, and we saw how the Jazz could respond, both leaving Gobert in or putting in favors. Both yielded about the same result. And that appears to be how this matchup will go, a tight one battled out by 2 great teams with 2 great coaches. With any luck, we'll get to see these teams battle it out again in the playoffs. As always, I'm Coach Mike with Lockdown Defense. Keep up the good work.